very much, and I appreciate being here. Yeah, I was, very simply, I was the managing director of the Alpha chapter, so to speak, of the Bastiat Society in Charleston, and have been involved in it for a couple of years, and absolutely love it. Love Frederick Bastiat, love the topic of freedom, and as our motto is, those who work in freedom should know how freedom works. And a lot of us understand, I think, some free markets, but free markets is not exactly the same thing as capitalism. Capitalism is an outgrowth of free markets. So when we talk about capitalism or capitalism versus all the other types of kinds of economic organizations, we need to really understand what capitalism is, where it came from. And so that's kind of the gist of my talking tonight. And as we get started here, we'll go back, I'm going to use TV to get us started. So we're going to go back into our time machine a little bit and see what we can come up. Oh, that's too far back. That's too far back. All right, here we go. Who wants to be a millionaire? I love that. Okay, who wants to be a millionaire? Now, you know, I mean, almost everybody wants to be a millionaire. And when I was a kid growing up in the 50s and 60s, I mean, everybody, you know, that's what you wanted to be a millionaire. And I listened to my dad when he grew up. Everybody, you know, they read Horatio Alger, and everybody wanted to be successful and make, you know, come up with some idea. And today, though, the whole thing is turned around, where to want to be a millionaire is like to paste a target on you. You know, like these are the people that you got to beat down and everything. And this is really a terrible change in the sequence of history, and so we have to understand why we have to move away from this. And that's why we really need to learn about the basis of capitalism. So I'm going to go back, and by the way, you know, the thing is that I guess the cachet is, the thought is, it's so difficult to become a millionaire that only the 1% or the 5% to become a millionaire. And actually, I'm going to show you right now where that is absolutely poppycock. Anybody can become a millionaire. It is so easy to become a millionaire, it's almost a no-brainer. If, and there's a couple ifs, and I will explain to you what those ifs are. But literally anybody can become a millionaire. So let's go on our journey, and we're going to start off to understand a little bit about how we get there, and then we're going to go back into history and bring it all the way through. And this is going to be the fastest tour of history, I think, that you've ever. We're going to cover 40,000 years of human history in about 40 minutes. So anyway, so let's start out. I want you to meet Linda. Now, Linda is 20 years old, and she's working at McDonald's. All right, and she's making $8 an hour, just a little over minimum wage. Now, my suggestion to you is that Linda could easily become a millionaire. Actually, if she never made more than $8 an hour the rest of her life, adjusted for inflation, which would just normally adjust by the market, she could become a millionaire very easily. So one of the things that we need to think about is parents. Now, Linda was very fortunate to have a mom and dad who really cared for her and wanted to teach her. And she learned some good things. And one of the things that she learned from her mom is that you never want, no matter what job you've got out there, you never want to spend everything that you earn. You always want to save a little bit of your paycheck. And that's just kind of smart. So let's just assume that that Linda, starting out at $8 an hour, takes this advice from her mom, and she decides that she could live on $7 an hour, and that she's going to take $1 an hour and she's going to save that. It's $1 an hour out of the $8 an hour that she earns. All right, now, if we assume that comes out to about 40 hours a week, over 50 weeks, allow 2 weeks for vacations, that comes out to about 2,000 hours in normal work weeks per year, or $1 an hour is about $2,000 a year. About $165 a month is what that comes out to, $1 an hour. All right, so she's going to save that. Now, the second piece of advice she got was from her father. And her father said, look, you got to save that money, but you've got to invest the money. You can't just put it in the bank. You've got to put it out into the marketplace so that businesses can take that money and they can grow and expand. And that is how you're going to literally become a part owner, and you're going to grow over the years with the standard of living of the United States. And that's one of the best in the world. So that's what I recommend you do. So we're going to assume that she takes this $2,000 a year, $165 a month. And with that, you can't go out and actually buy a company. You can't really even buy stock in a company, but you can buy a mutual fund. So let's say she decides, and with the help of her dad, they looked at through some mutual funds, and they could have either maybe taken a fund that's an index of the Dow Jones 30 industrial stocks, you know, the blue chip stocks. So if she would have done that, and each period of time, and I'm going back 40 years, because 40 years hence she would be 65 if she's 20 now. Let's go back and see what would happen if she started this 40 years ago in 1972, all right, or 62. What we see is that investing $2,000 a year down here at this one right here, this is the index of the 30 Dow Jones stocks. So she is just shy at age 65 of being a millionaire, had she done that. Maybe, depending on what the markets do, she could actually be a little over that, maybe a little under, but she's going to be around a millionaire. Had she, though, chosen a managed mutual fund, and I went back to find one that's got a record that goes all the way back to 1928, before the start of the Great Depression, which is the Investment Company of America, a fund managed by the American Funds Company. So it actually has a track record going back that far. So if she would have just put $165 a month into that fund, she would have $3.6 million at the time of her retirement 40 years later. So she'd be a multi-millionaire on what? $1 an hour. So the only thing she had to do to become a millionaire was that she had to start early and she had to be self-disciplined to be consistent over a period of time. This doesn't take any money that if she married her husband puts in or increasing this over time. That's just $1 an hour. Now, is that possible to do? Hell yes. You can do that. It's just if you want to do it, or if we teach kids how to do it and why to do it, which they don't. I know about probably my experience mirrors yours, but I went through grade school, high school, undergraduate school, and graduate school, and not one time in all of that did I ever have a course that taught me anything about money. I had people say you've got to get your high school degree so you can make more money, got to get your college degree so you make more money, but nobody ever told me about money. I have 5 children. Some of them went to private school, some of them went to public school. Not one of them ever had, my one daughter in one school she went to had a small home economics course, but half of it was about cooking and homemaking and very little about budgeting or nothing about investing. So in essence, none of them learned anything about money. But isn't that kind of scary? I mean, here we are. This money is the medium of exchange of our whole society, and it's what brings up all this problem with poverty and all this stuff. And most of it is a lack of education, a lack of self-discipline. It has nothing to do with being lucky to be a millionaire. It's a process that you go through to become a millionaire. So anyway, that's kind of how we got it started. Now, let me ask you this question. This $1 per hour that she saves, and this is the critical thing. What does that represent? That represents a surplus, right? It's a surplus. It's what you have left over if you don't spend everything that you earn. And what I'm going to propose to you, that the whole basis of the capitalist economic system is the ability to first create a surplus and then to profitably use that surplus. And that's something that we've only really fairly recently, in last hundreds of years, not thousands of years, learned the importance of that and how that works. So what we're going to kind of do is go back through history and trace where that surplus comes from and how we've learned how powerful that surplus can be in building wealth and therefore building the standard of living that we have today to show for it in America. So, just to summarize, what are the conditions that allowed Linda to become a millionaire? First of all, she had to have freedom, right? We all have to have freedom to be able to pursue our goals, to state our case and make our own way. We had to have the freedom to own property. Without that, she couldn't have owned mutual funds, which basically own stocks, which are part ownership in companies. She had to have the freedom to earn and trade values so that she could trade and earn money working on her own. And she had to have the freedom from physical takings, to have the government or some political caste taking all of her money. And then finally, she had to have a mechanism that allows for the aggregation of that capital, that surplus, in order to improve productivity, which in this case was the mutual fund. The ability to take small amounts of money from masses of people, all put it together so that it creates capital that businesses can form and grow. And we'll see how that works in a little bit. So let's go back to Frederick Bastiat. Now, Bastiat used to talk in a metaphor about what was that guy's name that used to be Robinson Crusoe. I don't know if any of you have read Frederick Bastiat yet, but he always used to use the analogy with Robinson Crusoe. Here's Robinson Crusoe on a deserted island. What are you going to do? Well, a lot of kids have never heard of Robinson Crusoe today, but I think most of them have seen Tom Hanks in Castaway. It's the same idea. It's a modern-day Crusoe. So what happens? Tom Hanks, through a plane crash and everything, ends up on this, literally the only person on this deserted island. Now, if you're all alone, how do you survive? What do you have to do? You have to do everything for yourself. If you're going to have food, you have to go out and club something and drag it home, right? If you're going to have shelter, you've got to build the shelter. Clothes, you've got to do the clothes. Everything. And in fact, your entire life is basically spent just meeting those elemental needs. And for about the first 30,000 years of human existence, that's how humans lived. They lived literally hand to mouth, where everybody made everything, gathered all their own food, collected all their own game, did everything themselves, and therefore there was not any time and certainly any surplus to do anything with. It's just scratching and eking out a living as we go along. About 20,000 years ago in human history, somebody got the brilliant idea of specialization, of what we now call the division of labor. And that is, if somebody would really concentrate on making the bone needles for sewing up the fishing nets, and then somebody else specialized in weaving the nets, and somebody specialized in grinding up the grain and making the bread, somebody make the moccasins and the thing, all of a sudden we're going to be a lot more productive, because it's much easier. You get to have a lot of skill when you start spending all your time studying that one thing. You learn about it, you learn what makes it work. You know how to do it when you've done anything repetitively. You start to figure out the shortcuts and how to make it better and faster. And that's what people started to do. So pretty soon, they could make tons of needle nets and things like that. So what are you going to do then? Now you got tons of needle nets. Well, people need needle nets, so you trade them for moccasins, and you trade them for whatever else you need. And that's how we kind of developed this exchange idea of taking this surplus of things that I've created through my own craft, and now I'm going to trade those with other people. Well, the problem is, eventually somebody's got all the moccasins they can use, and they got all the net needles they can use. So now you got a problem. So it wasn't probably within that same 8 or 10,000 year period, the idea of coming up with some sort of a medium of exchange, a universal medium of exchange, that you would convert the surplus you had into something that we would call money, cash. At first it started to be cow shells, or it could be a metal of some kind that was particularly useful, copper or eventually gold. But these kinds of things had a universal usefulness and were appreciated for their value, and therefore if I converted to those, this became like a battery. It stored the surplus, just like a battery stores energy that could then be used by other people. So we developed this medium of exchange. Well, all of a sudden when we did that, it kind of changed the whole dynamic. And you know that if you were going to build a house today, you could build that house on your own. People have built the house. But why would you? Because there are people in all these different areas that know far more about it than you do, and they can get it done quickly, and you just pay them, but you save all the time and energy and the wasted resources yourself. So it actually is much cheaper for you to have somebody and do all these things than for you to try to start from scratch, make the boards, do everything yourself. We don't have that much time in our human life to be able to do all that, and that's what we escaped from 30,000 years ago. So this division of labor has been one of the very early revolutions in humanity that allowed us to start to create a little bit of a surplus. Now, the next big step came to understanding all this, and this was back in the very late 1700s. There was a British an inventor, a tinkerer, mechanic, an engineer, and he was sitting around one day, and he was watching a horse. And this horse was tied to a long pole, and the horse was walking around a circular track that was turning a valve underneath to let water come in and out of a sluiceway that was then used for a little grinding mill down the way. And so Jim, we'll call him Jim, he was sitting there watching this occur, and he started to run some calculations in his mind to come up with how much energy was this horse using in order to go walk around this track and turn this valve. And he came up with this formula. And this formula was what we now call 1 horsepower. This is what a horsepower is. It's the energy released in an hour by a horse doing that X amount of work, which is how many feet he calculated in an hour that horse was going around pulling this thing. So now, interestingly, we know what 1 horsepower is. How much horsepower does human labor generate? That is, myself going out and pulling something or carrying something or digging in the ground, how much power can I generate? Well, the fact is I can generate about 1/10 of a horsepower. About 1/10 of a horsepower. So, and this represents how still about 1/3 of all the human populations in the world are generating their power by pure, brute physical labor. Pure, brute physical labor, like they've done for 30,000 years. So now, along comes somebody, gets a brilliant idea of inventing the wheel. Basically started out probably as a rock that just happened to have some sides that were not perfectly square, and somebody noticed that it rolled, and it started out very heavy, and eventually they got the idea of making, cutting down the weight, making spokes in it, making it easier. The whole idea, the history of the wheel as a topic in itself is quite fascinating. But using a wheel as leverage, you now can generate about a third of a horsepower with the human then, and you can see how many more bricks this guy can carry in that little thing with that cart that one human can still do. So we're up to a third of a horsepower. Well, how about a horsepower? Well, here's a horse. It's actually here, coupling it with the wheel, and you can see the order of magnitude of now how much extra weight that you can carry and extra produce you can carry. So imagine somebody here, imagine this person here who is able to, by their sheer self-discipline of being able to squeeze out a little bit of surplus from the measly little pennies that they earn doing that, so that eventually they're able to maybe purchase a cart. When they can now actually do the work of 3 people. So they're 3 times as productive as they were before. Now they're making a little bit more money. So they take that little bit of extra surplus they're getting and they're able to eventually buy a horse and cart. Now they can actually, since they're being so productive, they can actually get other people who formerly were doing the 1/10 of a horsepower, they can start hiring them and providing them with some equipment. And now all of a sudden you can see how this generates more and more productivity. Just in an absolute order of magnitude, each step higher and higher and higher. And this is kind of fabulous, but yet this is still all the way up until the end of the 1700s. This is as far as it ever got. This was it. I think that's kind of amazing to me. So what we want to do now is start talking about some revolutions, because all of a sudden, starting about 400 or 500 years ago, we started to have, 600 years ago, we started to have some amazing revolutions, and they changed that whole dynamic of what we were just looking at. Now, in 1400, there were no books. You had manuscripts. Everything was written by hand. If you could get a manuscript of the Bible, for example, it would cost the equivalent of about 4 years' wages of anybody. But it would be totally useless for them to have, because most people couldn't read. Unless you were a nobleman or a prince or a king of some sort, the chances are you couldn't read. Only about 2 or 3 or 4% of the people back in those times, the Middle Ages, could read. So it was pretty much useless to have that. How would it happen? How would you learn? Well, it was mostly through oral tradition. And in fact, this is a manuscript page of Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. This is written in the Old English of the time, and this basically, by the way, Geoffrey Chaucer was the father of the English literature, and he died in 1400. And if you would have been in an English town where we might have had a small venue, or at the castle where somebody would come by and read Chaucer, it might have sounded something like this, okay? And I'm going to just actually recite for you this first prologue here to the Canterbury Tales in the Old English. All right, this proves that I had a college education. I think it's marvelous. All right, here we go. One that aprile with the sure salt the craft of March hath passed to the root, and bothered every vein, and swish the core of which felt when John it is a poor. One zephyrus ake with a sweeter breath, the spirit hath in every colt and hath the tender croppus, and the younger son hath in the ram his half-course Eurona. Smaller fowl and muck and melody did schleppen all the neck with open ear, so pricketh him not sure in her garages, then longing folk to go on pilgrimages. In Palmer's for the sake of strange straws to fair house, quoth in sundry lands, and especially from every shire's end of England to Canterbury they went, the holy blissful martyr for the sick, that him hath helped them when that they were sick. Thank you very much. $30,000 have paid off all that time. But that's how you would. That's how it would have happened. That's how you would have gotten it. But all of a sudden, something happened, and I'm going to explain it this way. Let's look at life as being a box of puzzle pieces. I had this happen to me. It's kind of funny. I was up in Maine on vacation a couple years ago, and I go up there usually for about 2 weeks in the fall, kind of think back, get recharged, do a little writing and everything. Well, after about a week of that, I'm kind of bored. To be honest, I get as much lobster as I can do, and I'm pretty. So I'm looking around the cabin that I rent for something to do, and I found a box of puzzles. One of these pieces looks like that. And so I get it out and I put it down on the table, and I'm all ready to go to start doing a puzzle. And I'm looking at these, I'm going, okay, now what's this supposed to be? Because what it turned out was I was missing the cover of the box that had the picture of what it's supposed to be. I hadn't a freaking clue of what this was going to be, and who would? It looked just like that. Now, Stuart Kaufman, who's a biologist but also studies information theory, he has a theory about this, and it's called the adjacent possible. And if you think about human history, through the first 30,000 years of human history, this is how the world appeared to people. It was totally mysterious. They didn't know what caused thunder. They didn't know what caused lightning. They didn't know why they got sick, why the roads, why the streams. They didn't know anything. They didn't know diddly squat, as we would say. Right? And they only started learning things through hard knocks and getting eaten by saber-toothed tigers and knowing not to do that again, and all that kind of stuff. And it took them very, very slowly to start putting the pieces together. First, you take a couple pieces, then all of a sudden, something starts, you start getting a pattern, and this might be, around 1100, AD. We starting to actually get some patterns and things. Pretty soon, we start to see a face, all right? Now we're starting to get around 1400, where we are right now in the narrative. And then pretty soon, we've got the whole picture, right? And so we know that. So what happens is that as we put more and more of these pieces of the puzzle together, more and more things become possible to understand. We just didn't have enough things to understand yet. But around 1400, something happened. And that was this guy who we'll call Johnny. Most of you know Johnny Gutenberg, right? Johnny Gutenberg. Well, Johnny Gutenberg started the first of our revolutions. And that is the information revolution. Because around 1450, he was, through experimenting with an old wine press, he created the very first movable type press. This is something that's absolutely fantastic because, as I said, up till now, everything was done by scriveners or scribes or by monks in a monastery, and they were all hand-done monasteries. They'd make a master copy, like we make a master copy of the disc, and then people would borrow that, and other scribes would copy from that, maybe on commission from some owner that would want to have that book, or that manuscript copy. That's how it went. So there were very few around, and most of the copies of any manuscripts were in the monkery, not the nunnery, but the monkery. That's where they were. So this guy, once you got a printing press where you can fairly easily start putting books together, books, this kind of like set the world on fire. And within 50 years, by 1500, all of the cost of books had started to drop like crazy, and the volume of books started to go out like crazy. By 1500, the cost of a Bible had dropped from 4 years of wages to about 2 weeks of wages. People were buying Bibles. They were flying off the shelves. And that, more than anything else, helped launch the revolution. Why? Because that was the first book that was published. People couldn't read. These books started coming out, and all of a sudden, there's something that they could have in their hand, and they could start learning to read. Not only that, almost as simultaneously with printing the first Bibles, they got translated from the Latin and the Greek, which Bibles had always been written in, into English, French, German, so the people out in the world could start learning how to read the Bible. And they started learning then how to read other things. And so pretty soon, all kinds of books manuscripts and old scrolls and documents started coming in from the monasteries. Oh, we got to print these, get them out, get them out, get them out. This was literally like inventing the computer back then. It just totally revolutionized the way everything happened. Well, this also spawned the next revolution. And I call it the Freedom Revolution. And this was the Protestant Reformation. Because once around 1500, people started reading the Bible. And they're reading this Bible, and they're reading this Bible, and they're going, where's the Pope? There's no Pope in the Bible. What's happening here? What's this los? What's going on here? This is not right. And so you got guys like around 1550 in Geneva, Switzerland, Martin Luther. And you got, in Austria, and then you got in Switzerland, Martin Luther, or John Calvin, around 1530. And so these two together launched the Protestant Reformation. And the whole thing was basically about anti-authoritarianism. Going away from the authority of the church and looking at the Bible yourself, reading it, getting a personal relationship with God. Well, isn't that basically about, I can do it myself. I don't need, Big Brother to teach me. I don't need the Pope telling me how to read the Bible. I can read the Bible myself. That's kind of launched the Freedom Revolution. And so that's a really powerful, I think sometimes we underestimate that, unfortunately, it's always tied into religion, but in a way that launched everything where we are today. Very, very powerful thing that we have to look back. Well, now we got all these books being printed, and this kind of launched the next revolution, which was the scientific revolution. And I think many people will think that of all the Father's Day that we should celebrate on Fathers, Galileo is one, because he's not only the father of physics, but he's also sometimes called the father of science, because he basically invented the scientific method. He borrowed ideas from some of the people that went before him, but he put it all together with the idea that we can learn the world by experimentation, by empirical evidence. We can go out, we can look at things, we can try to duplicate things, we can parse things, we can take them apart, reduce them down, and figure out how they work. He was a genius at that. And he started publishing books. And of course, these books were now printed on the printing presses, and people just, thousands of miles away could read Galileo's works, and then they could start duplicating things and trying things on their own. He also launched the optical revolution because he really made optics useful for putting in a telescope or a microscope so that we could extend how far we could see or how close up we could see, which again launched all of the potential to understand about how cells work and germs and all those kinds of things that were out of sight, and how the celestial bodies might work now that we got this telescope. The fact that there were planets out there, they were planets and not wandering stars, which is what the word planet means. They actually were planets, and they shone with reflected light from the sun and their light. And all these things never were known before we had the telescope, before Galileo. So really a phenomenal revolution that occurred that then aided, because the scientific stuff was started to be applied toward producing things, understanding how things work, to start making things better. They would say, well, maybe we could do it this way. We start learning how metals work. Maybe instead of using a wood plow, we could put a metal head on it. You know who came up with that idea? You're going to laugh at how recently that is. Thomas Jefferson really made the first metal-headed plow. They'd be using wood. I mean, you could go through New England with a wood plow, rocky soil. What are you, nuts? That's crazy, but that's what people did for hundreds of years. So, all right. So now the freedom revolution then launched into the political revolution. The political revolution, John Locke was one of many who understood what the implications were of the Protestant Revolution. And he really looked at property rights, and he was one of the ones that gave us our notion of property rights. Coming from now my adopted home of South Carolina, very interesting, because any of you have been to Charleston, you'll hear names down there like Ashley and Cooper and all that kind of stuff. Well, Ashley Cooper was a guy. His name was Anthony Ashley Cooper. He was one of the 8 Lords Proprietors. The Lords Proprietors in the very beginning, North Carolina and South Carolina and Georgia were all the province of Carolina. Really, up until about 1712, it was just one province, and there were 8 Lords Proprietors, and Anthony Ashley Cooper was one of those Lords Proprietors. He was given a tract by King Charles II of all this land here, along with 7 other proprietors. Well, interestingly, his personal secretary was who? John Locke. And so when Anthony Ashley Cooper wanted to draft the fundamental constitutions for the Carolinas, who did he have drafted? John Locke. So in 1699, he drafted the Constitution of the United States, which was the South Carolina Constitution, or the preliminary, the progenitor of that. And that is, Thomas Jefferson went to that document to get much of the wording and so forth he used in the Declaration of Independence. I mean, it's kind of an interesting how that all fits together. But that's kind of launched this whole idea of the free markets, the limited government. We don't need the king, we need limited government, and we need property rights, because when you have rights to property, you take care of the property, you tend to want to maximize the best use of that property, instead of the old problem, which was the commons, where you held everything in common, and some people were really good at managing it, some people were terrible, and they were slackers, and then the people saw the slackers, and then they didn't want to work as hard, and it never did very well. So this idea of property ownership really started taking hold in England, and that launched the next revolution, which was the agricultural revolution. Now, I like to talk about Jethro Tull, because many of you in the room think of that as a rock group. But actually, the rock group was named after the real Jethro Tull, who was this dude right here. And he was really basically one of a number of fathers of what we call the agricultural revolution, because as the common areas that we had in England started to be dispersed and started to come under private ownership, what we call that enclosure, where we took these common fields and started, all of a sudden productivity started going crazy, because now, if I've got my plot of land, my 40 acres and a mule, so to speak, it's mine. I can start growing like crazy, spending my own labor, and now I can sell the extra produce that my family doesn't need, so all of a sudden, I can maybe become middle class. I can actually build a life for myself, and this was very powerful. What this guy did that launched that revolution was he came up with a couple of inventions, and the most important was what we call the seed drill, which is this right here. Now, up until this time, how was land planted? Well, basically, agricultural land was done by hand. What you would have is you'd have your horse, or maybe an individual if you weren't wealthy enough to have a horse, and you'd plow furrows. Now, a furrow was 220 yards long. And now, if you're ever into horse racing, you'll know and may have heard of a furlong. Well, that's where the furlong comes from. It's from the furrow. That's the length of the furrow. All right? And so then you have these furrows, and then, and listen to this is crazy, the farmer would take the seed, and he'd go out there and he'd just, cast it about. That's how you would do it. And the idea was that some of the seeds would fall in the furrows, and then he'd close them in, and they would do well. And the ones that landed on top, most of them didn't germinate, or the sun ate, got rid of them, or animals got them. But it was the most inefficient way, and it would take days just to plant 1 acre. I mean, it was very time-consuming. Before dawn in the morning till dusk at night, it was the worst labor that you could ever think of to have to do that. Well, now the seed plow pulled behind a team of horses, it goes along, and what it does is it digs the little hole, it has a drill that goes down, drops the seed in, and then covers it up and goes on the way. And so you can plant a whole acre in a couple hours. It totally revolutionized agriculture over the next 50 or 60 years after this was invented. So as we get into the 1840s and 50s, in England, the percentage of people that worked in agriculture went from about 70% of the population to about 40% of the population. They need that. That's how productive they were. For the first time in the history of humanity, famines weren't the major thing that everybody was worried about. Prior to this, for families, we had famines come every 8 or 9 years and wipe out large percentages of the populations. Starting around the 1840s or 50s, we had the last famine. That was it. I haven't had one in the industrialized Western world since. Still, and I have very few in the other areas because we're starting to, we figured out, how to solve that problem. That's pretty amazing, actually, right? So now all of this is happening. We're really getting productive. Now, what's happening to all those millions of people in the English countryside that now don't need to work in agriculture? What are they going to do? Well, that's what happened to the next revolution. And all of a sudden, something happened. That last piece of the puzzle came together, and I like to say, pow. Because this guy right here is the guy that launched it all. Now, remember, we are talking about 1790, right? So in 1795, when this guy, remember him, Paul Revere? He set out on that April morning to go out and warn Lexington that the British were coming. Look how he was traveling. This is 1775. Was he in a sports car? ATV or anything like any kind of a device at all? No, bicycle, motorcycle, nothing. On a horse, the same way we've done for 30,000 years. Well, horses, 10,000 years, right? That's how people got around. That was it. And if you would have gone to Charleston in 1775 or even 1800, 1840, that's all you would never hear. What? A motor. You never hear a motor. All you hear is horses, the clanking of the reins and the clopping of the feet. That's what you hear. That's how life was. And they crap all over the place and pee all over the place was a zoo. If you look at New York City, the thousands of tons of horse manure that were taken out. Who would? It was smelly and horrible. And who would have? It was just unbelievable. But then this guy comes along and he does something that actually was thought of 2,000 years earlier. And around the time that Christ lived, there was a guy in Greece by the name of Hero of Alexandria. And Hero concocted a steam engine of sorts. He would heat it, it would come to boiling, it had 2 little outlets on either side which would cause it to spin around. By the way, you might not have noticed this, he also actually literally invented the coin vending machine too at the time. He used Greek coins, and he would be able to disperse water through a vending machine kind of a thing with putting a coin in. The guy was a brilliant guy. But guess what? The pieces of the puzzle weren't there that he could connect the dots. He didn't have enough to see how things worked. And so the adjacent possible wasn't quite far enough along that he could see how to make it work. But this guy, James Watt, he's our guy that came up with that formula while he was tinkering about the horsepower, right? That we named that unit of energy called the watt after. This is the guy who put it all together. He perfected the steam engine. He didn't invent the steam engine, but he figured out a way to make it work on an industrial basis. And that literally launched an entire new world. So I look at about 1800 is the launch of the modern world. Everything else up to that were revolutions that were happening, you saw, over just a couple hundred years. Totally changed the world. This is what really did it. And this is where capitalism switched over from just free market, personal exchange and small business exchange over into what we know it today as the powerhouse that has really brought the masses of humanity in the most fabulous level of time in all of history. So what was able to happen is he invented this machine that could do a tremendous amount of work, far more work than 1 horsepower can do. And that is the critical thing. It enabled also the factory system, because now you could put these steam engines and machines one by one together that could do work, and now you had all of these people that were displaced out of the agricultural thing that were looking for something to do at exactly the time that this occurred. So they started coming into the cities and working in these factories. They learned how to do it, and what happened? Well, their incomes went up, like dramatically. All of a sudden, they actually were making a wage, and although we might consider it horrid working conditions, as some of the muckrakers and people like that did, these people, believe me, they were happy. They were happy to have their kids come in and work, because, you know, the most dangerous place in the world is to work on a farm for a kid. You know, the machine, the primitive kinds of machines they had would kill kids like crazy. And of course, these machines weren't a whole lot better, but they were a lot better. They were some better. And so they would bring their kids in, and they would work, and all of a sudden they could start buying things. They could have a house, they could do things. It was an absolutely amazing transformation. They could also take all this equipment, and they could, along with the discovery of oil in Titusville in 1859 in Pennsylvania, they could start now building refineries, and we now have another powerful source besides steam. We now have oil, which then provides oil as an energy source by itself, would fuel oil lamps and things of that nature, which we started to have lighting. If you think about before that, we had some candles that you would blow out at 10 o'clock at night, you know, and you couldn't afford to keep candles going all night. It was too dangerous and everything. So all of a sudden we had to go and stay up later, change the way we worked and the way we dealt with our family and everything. We could also refine gasoline and diesel fuel, which then could be used not just 1 horsepower, but 100 horsepower in a truck. Again, order of magnitude will work. How about 1,000 horsepower? A train, you know, imagine all the boxcars and everything, what the power that a train can do. Or thousands of horsepower on these big cargo carriers that come into the port of Charleston that I see every day. Unbelievable amount of transformation that ability to start creating that steam and get that increase in power, and it just revolutionized the world, and it really allowed us to get where we are today. So that's kind of how we take this step by step to see how this ability to go from physical, hard, brute labor to having the machines do this work for us, it has just been absolutely, what can I say, but a miracle. Now, the one thing in common that it took to do that, starting with James Watt, if you read the early history of the steam engine, it took capital. It took surplus. It took people having some extra money or getting it somehow from investors so that they could start doing it. You know, prior to that, other than to take some ship-going adventures for discovery, there wasn't really a whole lot of need for capital, because most businesses were kind of small little operations, and you pretty much lived on what you made. You didn't really expand a whole lot. There was no way to expand. It didn't do any good to expand. You just did your guild or whatever, your little forge that you would have, or a bakery or whatever, and that's what you did. But all of a sudden now, if we're going to buy these machines or build these machines, they're not cheap. They take capital, so we have to start coming up with ways to get capital. So we start seeing really the corporation coming into its own. We start to see joint ventures and capital ventures where we're coming in. We start to see a stock market start coming up in the early 1800s. They start really getting the idea. Actually, and I happen to be lucky to have a copy of one of the very first stock certificates. In my former life, I owned a stock brokerage firm, and I collected antique stock certificates. And one of them I have, which was 1795 Pennsylvania, Lancaster and Philadelphia Turnpike, which was the first stock certificate that actually had a little vignette on the top of it. It's on animal skin vellum, and there are about 100 of them that are still in existence. And I bought one 30 or 40 years ago, and now it's worth about $2,000. It's kind of cool. But you have a real piece of history like that. But that's how they started doing. And notice that road was not done by the government in Pennsylvania. It was done by private investors who would go together, and they realized, it'd be good to have a road to go over there because we're there all the time. So let's get together to build a road. All right, we all get together and build a road. We don't need the government to do that. They didn't wait around. That wasn't until Andrew Jackson and some of those guys got in there that they started figuring out they could soak the government to come up with all the money to do that. Private people had done that most of the time from the beginning. So at any rate, so it takes capital. So we have to come up with that capital. So capital was privately owned surplus created by spending less than we earn. Capitalism is the social system based on individual rights, private property, free markets, limited government under the rule of law that allow, all these things allow for the free and private aggregation of capital. That's capitalism. It's taking the idea of the free markets one step further. It's actually having a system that we take this capital, we bring this capital together, we put it out in the marketplace so that people have a source of this money that they can go out then and start building their businesses and being what we call entrepreneurs. Very, very powerful idea. And in fact, most of the other systems that are out there, communism, socialism, if you read Karl Marx, he's really absolutely, the Communist Manifesto is actually kind of hysterical to read it. Because in the Communist Manifesto, the first part of it is extolling the virtues of capitalism. How it's capitalism that brought the masses out of their poverty and everything. It's just that communism is going to be the next step. The next step. But still, capitalism is what did it. So, I mean, it's very, very powerful. All the other isms pretty much rely on capitalism for their funding, or they couldn't just come into being. Socialism just couldn't happen because it would be lacking that power of the free capital and the free markets. All right, so I mentioned early on that this surplus, this capital, is stored in the form of money or assets, and that's very much like a battery, because now that can be used by other people. They can take that battery, they can discharge that capital to whatever particular business they might happen to want to do. That energy that comes out of there is used. People would buy that money or borrow that money or invest that money for innovation, for modernization, for business expansion and growth. And we have what we call a virtuous cycle. We have investment spawning growth, increased productivity means more employment, creates more surplus, and so forth and so on. And this has happened since James Watt's time. Now, if we think about Wall Street, most people really don't understand what Wall Street. Most people, Wall Street is the after part of the market, which is people that already own stock buying and selling. The casino, you hear people call it the Wall Street. I hear ads on TV, the Wall Street casino. Don't get involved in the Wall Street casino. But Wall Street serves a very fundamental purpose in this capital formation. This is sort of what happens. We have this person that has their surplus. It could be Linda, it could be you or I. We have this money to invest. So a company that needs this capital in order to buy their equipment or whatever, they go to the marketplace and they will have what's called an IPO, an initial public offering. They'll put this out to the marketplace and they'll say, here's what we're going to do, here's what we are going to do with the money, here's how you might participate in this. And then if people buy onto that, they say, yeah, I want to invest in that, and then they pay the cash and they buy the stock, and now they own the stock. So what happens to the business? The business now has the money. So the business takes the money, they build their new buildings, they expand where they're going, they hire more people, they buy more machinery, and what happens to productivity? Productivity goes up, more surplus is created, and who wins with the more surplus? Well, the business owners, of course, win, but the owners of the business are the shareholders. And of course, they win as that capital grows. That capital that surplus is wealth. Is the wealth. Wealth is surplus. It's not, you're not wealthy by what you need to scratch out a living every day. You're wealthy by the surplus. That battery, as it gets larger and larger, potential energy in there, that capital, that's wealth. Alright. So, interestingly, since 1970, because more and more countries are catching on to the free market ideas, we've literally seen the benchmark of poverty, which is what it takes to earn $1 a day in the world. We've seen it drop by 80% since 1970, and it's continuing to drop continually. I mean, that is unheard of. To imagine a drop in poverty never happened in history. Poverty's always increased over time, not gone down. But as more and more countries start to learn about how the free markets work and the advantage of them, we see literally the decline in the poverty rate that is unparalleled. And interestingly, if you look at, for example, the Fraser Institute in Canada, puts out a study. You might have been already, being Bastiat members, have been alerted to that. If not, you should look it up online. But they put out basically an index of freedom every year. And they take all the 204 countries and they go through and they rate them on 6 different parameters of economic freedom. And what you can see is the more free a country is economically, the more prosperous that country is and the least amount of poverty. If you look at the worst offenders, if you go to places like Argentina or you go to North Korea, places like that, which look like East Berlin 50 years ago, that's a stark reality. There's a great picture, which I don't have time to show, but I've shown in times past, which is a satellite picture at night. You can find this online under Google. It's a picture at night of the Earth from a satellite. And you can see the prosperous areas of the world literally lit up by the city lights. And if you go over the Asian peninsula where Korea comes down, you literally see a part above South Korea that is totally black. It literally looks like, is this an island? Is South Korea an island? Where are the lights in North Korea? That ain't none, as we say in Kentucky. That ain't none. No lights there. Because there's utter, sheer, abject poverty there. So one of the things that we've discovered is that poverty is not a function of money. A lot of it's a function of the freedom and the government that a society has. The more free that society is, the more free that citizens are to own property in exchange, the more wealthy that society is. So you cure poverty not by more money, you cure poverty by more freedom. Freedom. Very amazing. So brings me to the last idea, which is what we hear about today, which is, sharing the pie, the 1%, the 5%. We need to take the money from them and distribute it. The fact of the matter is, and this is what most people don't understand, that since capitalism came about in the beginning of the 1800s, we have not had what we call a zero-sum game. In the old days, prior to capitalism, we had a zero-sum game. If I had more jewels, somebody else had less because there's only so many around. If I could get more oil, somebody else had less. If I could get more of any kind of a natural resource, somebody else got less. If I get more land, somebody else got less. That's called a zero-sum game. But once capitalism came about, now we started literally, with the stroke of a pen and using the human mind, we started to literally create capital. So I bring you two creators, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. Now imagine 50 years ago, without these two guys. Imagine the wealth. How many people do these two companies and all the suppliers that supply to them, how many people, how many jobs are they responsible for that did not exist prior to these guys? And if we take the people that are the richest people in the world and we look at most of them, what we find out, they're not rich because they have taken money from everybody and just bought all this land and all this stuff and everything. Most of that wealth is tied up in the value of the companies that they created. And the only reason these companies have reached that pinnacle is because the consumers have voted with their dollars that they like that company and they like that company's product. Walmart is rich because the consumers voted for Walmart with their dollars. Microsoft and Apple are rich. I had a friend that just got back from a trip down to the Bahamas, and he was sitting in this bar at the outside of the beach. And he was just sitting at the bar, and along the line here, he counted 11 Apple products on the bar, from Apple iPhones, iPads, iPods, all people listening stuff. 11. Can you imagine what it'd be like to get that many votes from consumers? To have a company right now that has in the bank $125 billion in the bank and owes nobody nothing? That's all just that's created capital. He didn't steal that from anybody. It wasn't a government or a tyrant that came in and confiscated it from his subjects. That was all done through free exchange. And consequently, we all benefit. I got my Apple computer there. We all benefit from that. And that's the nature of capitalism, that by creating the wealth, we create the wealth for all of us. And I just think that is just such a remarkable thing that if we don't explain this to people and tell people about it, they just won't get it. They never will. So anyway, I thank you very much. We'll see you.